Hello and welcome to my presentation. I'm so happy you're here with me today. The title, as you can see on the screen, is Learning in English While Learning English. I'm Carol Johnson. So as I started to write this presentation, I realized there was something I really wanted to share with you that would help give context to where the topic came from, etc. And so I thought I'd start with this. This is actually a screenshot of my home and the path I took for 8 years of my life in grades 1 through 8, going to St. Joseph Catholic School outside of Chicago, Illinois. And I needed to spend just a second with you and share that these were some of the best years of my life. And I'm always so appreciative that I got this amazing foundational education there. So I wanted to share that with you. And then one other thing is that, well, when I was a child, I thought it was, oh my gosh, the longest walk every day. In fact, when I looked online to prepare for this presentation, I discovered it was a half mile. So it really wasn't as far as I thought. But you know how perspective changes through life. So anyway, I wanted to start by sharing that with you. As concerns the topics that I'm going to cover in this presentation, I decided there were 3 really important ones I thought I should cover when we're talking about students who are learning in English while they are still learning English. So the first topic is how to identify English language learners' reading range in context of their English language proficiency level. And this context is so important. So I want to cover that topic first. Then I'm going to talk about how vocabulary knowledge affects reading comprehension. And I'm going to follow that up with the application essentially of these 2 pieces of information I'm going to cover by talking about how you apply this in your classroom. So how to select books to support learning across the curriculum. So let's get started. Now, the first topic I said I wanted to cover was how to identify English language learners' reading range in context of their English language proficiency level. And you can see I've really highlighted, pulled out, if you will, that in context of, because it is so important in terms of understanding how your students are reading. So the way I decided to express this as an example for you is through a screening report that you probably do with some product. And in this case, I'm using that as my example to talk about this topic. So this screening report that I have on the screen for you is a 5th grade class. So I ask you to imagine this is a 5th grade class, and this is all the students in the class. Now, it's a big class, no question. But imagine this is a 5th grade class, and this is all your students. And by all students, I mean native speakers of English and your English language learners. They're all in this report here. And each of these vertical bars represents a single individual student achievement level. In the green bars, the green vertical bars, those are students who are at or above benchmark. So we know those students are doing really well. In terms of the blue vertical bars, those are students who are approaching benchmark. So they're doing pretty well too. The yellow vertical bars represent students who are identified as in need of some intervention. And finally, the red bars, as you can imagine, those vertical bars represent students who are in need of urgent intervention. Now, one of the things I always like to say when looking at a report like this is that this is one test in time. So I want you to imagine that this is, in fact, really reflective of how the students are doing at that time. We're making an assumption that nobody was sick when they took the test that day, or was distracted or anything like that. So we want to look at this as good reflections of how your students or how these students are performing on the day they took this test. Now, I also have one other thing on the screen here, and that is a sample student, Nina. And what I want you to know about Nina is she is an English learner, which means she is one of the students who is learning in English while learning English. The question I have for you is, should you be worried about her? She certainly has been identified as a student in need of intervention, but the question is, should you be worried looking at this distribution? I think we have to drill a little deeper to kind of get the answer to that. So let's go to the next slide. This slide is one where I have grouped all of the English learners from that same fifth grade. So this is only English learners in this distribution. There are no students who are native English speakers in this report, in this screenshot. Now notice, of course, Nina is still here and she is still in the yellow. But the thing to notice about this slide as compared to the previous slide is that the distribution of achievement is completely changed. So notice there's only one student in green. There are 5 in blue. There are a lot of students in yellow. And then there are still several students in red. Now, I'm going to suggest that when I look at even this report, I still don't know whether or not I should be seriously concerned about Nina. I know she's behind. I know that. But what I don't know is there a good explanation for it? And remember, I started this discussion about the previous report saying, let's assume this is a good representation of where the student is. You know, she wasn't feeling sick that day. This is how she performs right now. So I'm going to look at one other way of considering how the students are performing, meaning how my English learners are performing. And on this slide, what I am now showing you is how I have grouped the same English learners from the previous slide, who were part of the slide before that, according to their English language proficiency level. In this instance, I'm using WIDA as an example. However, you may not. You may use the LPAC if you're in California. You may use ELPA 21. If you're in the Northwest, you may use TELPAS if you're in Texas. But consider you would do you would do something very similar if you had any of those English language proficiency standards than if you use these. It would be almost identical. It's just that you may have more or less levels of English language proficiency. But what I want you to see and get out of this slide is that once I group, if you will, my English language learners by their English language proficiency level, I have a much, much better picture of who is performing in terms of grade level achievement, grade level benchmarks, based on how much English they already know. And that's the thing about the English language proficiency level. The truth is, what those levels tell you is how much English the student has learned to this point, because that is obviously an ongoing process. So if I look on the top of the slide, left to right first, I see for students who are at WIDA level 1, which would be the lowest level of English language proficiency according to the WIDA standards, I can see that all those students are performing in the urgent intervention red category. Now that makes complete sense because they have the lowest level of English language proficiency in this grade. Now, it could be any other grade too. I do want you to know that. But right now, fifth grade is my example grade. If I look at WIDA level 2, I can see by that time, most of them are still in red, but one of them is now in yellow. Notice how this is going to start to be a sequencing that shows you essentially cause and effect. It will show that the more English a student knows, the higher they read in English. And there really is no surprise to that. It's that without this disaggregation, this grouping, you really have no way of making that comparison in real time. But this is something that I think is really important that you consider because this provides you with information about how your English language learners are reading in context of how much English they know. So if I look at Nina, who is at WIDA level 3, she's still in yellow. Notice I've put her at exactly the same point, and I can see by WIDA level 3 that students are now performing in yellow at the intervention level. Let's say that. So this is perfectly normal for her. If she were still in red and yet at WIDA 3, that would probably concern me. But she's not. She's performing just like other students in her grade at the same English language proficiency level. WIDA 4, by that time, notice I have one student in blue, the rest of them are still in yellow. WIDA 5, they're now in blue. That means those students are approaching benchmark. And finally, WIDA 6, which is when students usually have no need for any more support, separate support in the English speaking classroom. Notice they're now at either at or above benchmark, or certainly very close to it in terms of approaching benchmark. So that was kind of the first point I wanted to make for you. So I wanted to show you how this kind of disaggregation or grouping of students provides you with very meaningful information concerning how they're doing and whether or not what they're doing is typical given how much English they know. It's really important that you have this information if possible in real time. Now, the next thing is I wanted to kind of look at a typical second page of a report, irrespective of the product that you use. If you screen, you probably get a second page that looks something like this. And again, talking about Nina, I can see that she is below the 24th percentile rank. Now, that is low, but we know from the previous disaggregation that that is typical of a student who is at her English language proficiency level. So the thing about this is it's more information, but it's still not really information that you can directly apply in the classroom. And I think that all of us who teach definitely want data, but we want data that we can use in our classroom. So I want to just go down a little bit more on what would be a second page of this kind of example report and look at the information that is meaningful in classroom application concerning Nina. Now, all of the information on her I've highlighted in yellow. And you can see, for me, there are 3 pieces of information that are really important here. The first is that she's not at the 24th percentile rank, she's at the 10th. So she is really at a low percentile ranking, but again, we know why. We know the cause. The second is that her grade equivalent right now is a 3.0. Remember, this is a 5th grade class. So this tells me generally the level at which she can read. And finally, we can see her reading range, called her ZPD here, her zone of proximal development here, is somewhere between mid-second and mid-third grade. That information is really important as we move forward in applying this to supporting her in the classroom, to supporting what you are instructing in the classroom. So the first point was knowing your students' reading level, your English language learners' reading level in context of their English language proficiency level. And I think that that information alone is incredibly meaningful and important for you to have. But the second piece of information I believe that is critical is an understanding of how vocabulary knowledge affects reading comprehension. So this is what the research says. The research says that if you're going to ask me or a student or anyone to read a book, read a passage, read a text, and understand it, I have to already know somewhere between 90 and 98% of the words in that passage or text or book. Now, the research that I've cited on the screen is one that I like particularly because it's very linear in its reveal of how that works. Essentially, the more words you know, the more you can understand. I also want to share with you that this research on the field topic of vocabulary and reading comprehension is really robust. It is on both native speakers and non-native speakers. This happens to be non-native speaker research here. And it tells us that no matter who's reading, they have to already know almost all the words to understand. And the thing is, that's important to know because when we provide a text to someone, we're not asking them to just get the gist. We want them to understand it, to comprehend it, so they can build knowledge. So I want to take a moment and share with you how I learned this lesson permanently, originally. So this is me in the fourth grade, and I told you where I went to school in the opening of this presentation. And one of the reasons I became so fascinated with language and language acquisition stemmed from my childhood in Catholic school. Now, I am old enough so that when we went to Mass, and we did 5 days a week at the beginning of school, the school day, Mass was still in Latin. And as a young child, I thought that was the coolest thing I had ever heard. Now, I had no idea what was being said, but it was fascinating to me, and I did learn how to repeat it. What I didn't recognize at that time was that I didn't understand it. And there's a big difference. I took pride in being able to repeat, but that's not the same thing as comprehension. I also in Catholic school in the sixth grade was introduced to French. So my language background really stems directly from this opportunity. How fortunate I am that my parents sent me and my siblings to this school. So I wanted to share that with you because this is really where I started to understand that how many words you know matters. So now, when we're talking about comprehension in a text, I want to think back to that slide I showed you that said that you have to already know 90 to 98 words and percent of the words in a text to be able to comprehend. That slide also said that 85% is not enough. And if you know less than 85%, that text is actually incomprehensible to you. So here I have an example for you of a third grade text. And I provided a third grade text because that's the level at which Nina reads. So I wanted to give a sense of that here. So let's read this text. And by the way, I have X'd out all of the high frequency words that an early language learner, an early English learner will not know. What I've left are the high frequency words that are taught first. So all of the blank blank around or blank the sun. This means that the sun is a central point around which the blank blank in a generally circular or blank blank. Now, when I read that and you read that, we're educated, we're adults, we already have this content knowledge. But it's not the same for children in school. They are learning this knowledge through the language. Okay. So when I read that and you read that, we have a sense of what it's about. What we really don't know, though, is any detail. And this is what it looks like to try to read a text that is incomprehensible. Now, sometimes we like to say as language teachers, and I've been a language teacher too, just like I know many of you have, sometimes we like to say, well, that's why we give bilingual dictionaries. But what I will share with you as a language learner, so after I learned French initially in an elementary school, I went on to get a bachelor's and master's in French. I can tell you my experiences as a language learner with a dictionary taught me that you can only look up so many words. But at one point you just lose complete, flow of what's being said and you're just surviving sentence by sentence. And we're not trying to have students survive sentence by sentence. We want them to understand a passage. So let's look at what it's like to read this same passage where I've now given 85% coverage, which means the student would know 85% of the words of this passage, would already know that many. I've added in the ones that were brought in because of that additional 5%. And again, I've done it by word frequency. So the more frequently used words I've now brought in. And I'll share with you that's something that can be done by corpus linguistics, if anyone's interested in that kind of detail. But at any rate, what I want to share with you is you can see the words I brought in that are in blue, and I have one word there in pink. Now, the reason I have it in pink is because I know that an English language learner at an earlier level will know the word top versus bottom, for example. But the student is not as likely to know the second or tertiary meaning of this word. And I think it's really important to point that out in our texts, particularly our texts for school, our academic texts. Those words are often a different meaning than the initial first basic meaning of a word. And this is an example of that in this text. Now, I'm going to argue that, in fact, this is still fairly incomprehensible. It would be to me if it were in a language that I don't know well enough. This is what that same text looks like if you already know 95% of the words. Notice this is comprehensible. It's a completely different experience when you know somewhere between 90 and 98%, and this is 95. What I also want to point out on this slide is that the words that are not yet shown are up in that box on the right side of the screen. And I'll share with you that 4 out of 5 of those words are likely to be keywords that all students are learning from a textbook. Think about that, native speakers and English language learners. So I wanted to show you that that's really how this works. The other word I have bolded up there is tetherball, because tetherball is an incredibly low frequency word. And so one of the best ways of explaining if it's not on your playground is to in fact give a student a picture. So this text would now be comprehensible to anyone who can read it at the 95% coverage level. So I want to turn now to the third topic that I think is important, and that is finally the application of this information. So it's one thing to know that your students are reading appropriately given how much English they know. It's another thing to know how many words, what percentage of words they need to already know to understand a text. But the application of that is what really matters, because the other until then is great information, but there's no practical application to it. So what I've done here is stayed with this topic of science and space. Let me say it that way. Now, I chose as an example the next generation science standards. I wasn't sure which ones you might use in your diocese, your school, etc., but I decided, or your classroom. So I decided that I would go with this generic one. This is a 5th grade science standard, and it relates to space, the planets, etc. And I thought that it would be easier to make the connection between, or I hoped it would be easier to make the connection between that 3rd grade passage I just shared with you in the vocabulary coverage and this standard, and then the application in your classroom. Now, I want to stop and think about the fact that in a classroom where English is the language of instruction, that means we are using typically a grade level textbook. So if Nina is in the 5th grade, and that's the example that I'm using in this presentation, she is then exposed to a 5th grade science textbook. But we know from that earlier information that Nina doesn't read at a 5th grade level. So our goal is to find a way to support the instruction in the classroom by providing alternative means of, or supplemental means of reading. And that's what I'm going to share with you right now. I'm going to share with you how you might consider supporting the knowledge that you want Nina to gain from your classroom instruction by supporting it perhaps with reading, homework reading or extra reading in the classroom, or however you elect to do that. So back to, remember, this is Nina's reading level, somewhere between mid-2nd and mid-3rd grade. And I want to really, really emphasize this one point before I show you books, because this is the crux of the matter. If you are results driven in your classroom, and I believe all of us who teach want the results from what we do in the classroom, where we put our energy, we want to know that we are causing an effect by what we do. It's important to understand the critical nature of comprehension and how much it matters. And this is what it comes down to, particularly for your English language learners. When we understand what we hear and what we read, we then acquire language and develop literacy. And that is what you are working on fostering in your English language learners in your classroom. You want your efforts to help them acquire more language and develop higher levels of literacy, and therefore more learning. And so I really wanted to spend just a second on this slide because this research by Stephen Krashen is robust. And everyone in the language learning world knows that this is a reality in terms of cause and effect. So I thought it was really important to share this with you before I just show you books. So I went and picked digital books as an example to show the kind of perhaps supplemental reading you could provide a student like Nina to make sure you're supporting the instruction that you're giving her from, in your classroom in science. That was the cover of the book, but it's the inside of the book that matters. And these are 2 pages that are representative of the inside of this book. And you can see that these are high frequency words with the exception of the names of the planets, which those are words that all students have to learn. And the grammatical structures, the sentence structures are not heavy. They're not overly complex. They're really direct, more simple sentence structures. And that's really important because, again, we want to support Nina's learning with comprehensible input. And this would be comprehensible to a student like Nina. This is, in fact, a book that is for her reading level. So I wanted to start by sharing that with you. And you can see that if you help her learn through this book, meaning adding into what you're teaching in the classroom, this will give her the background knowledge to, in fact, really gain even more from your instruction in the classroom. This is another book. You can see it's a lower level book, but I want to show you the inside of it so you can see how I'm in fact sequencing from lower level reading as I move it up just a little bit to support Nina in her growth in reading. This one has more text on the screen than the other. The sentences are a little bit longer than the previous ones, but they're still not really complex grammatical structures, and they are still a lot of high frequency vocabulary. Those 2 things are both really important, and they're supported by pictures, which also helps ensure that there is comprehension of what's being read. The words that perhaps are unknown are words that Nina could look up. And in fact, most digital books like this come with a dictionary system that allows that. Or they may even be words that you are teaching specifically in your classroom. So on the bottom left of the screen, I see dwarf with respect to dwarf planets. The other thing that I like in this book, for example, is that the example they give for gravity has to do with a baseball. A baseball is a high frequency word that Nina would be likely to know already, her English language proficiency level. And this all helps facilitate certainly growth in language, growth in literacy, and growth in knowledge that helps achieve the science standards that you're working on in your classroom. This book looks like a very young student's book from the cover, especially because it references singing about the planets. But when I opened up this book, what I discovered, and again, all these 3 books are at her reading range, within her reading range. I wanted to share that before I forgot. But here, there's a little bit longer sentence structure in some of these. So notice here, the first sentence, the sun and the 8 planets circle around it make up our solar system. The reason I wanted to point out that sentence is that this is just like the word top that I gave in that previous example where the meaning of the word top is not a primary meaning, but it's secondary or tertiary, in fact. And here the word circle is used as a verb, where students are normally initially taught the word circle as a verb, but in fact a noun. These are things that help develop the students' language, develop their literacy further, and make it easier for them to learn from you in the classroom where the instruction is in English and from the textbook that they are using at home too. I wanted to just share one other thing, and that is I wanted to consider, even when you have English as your language of instruction in the classroom, if you have students whose language is Spanish, another thing to consider is having them read, assuming they know how to read in Spanish. If they don't, that's fine too. If they do know how to read Spanish, you can support their knowledge development by having them read Spanish and learning content that way too at home. And even though I understand the language, a classroom where English is the language instruction, that won't be something that will be done in the classroom. It does help develop knowledge, and because there are so many cognates in between English and Spanish, it does help make learning in English easier. So just in case anyone doesn't know, cognates are words that look the same, very similar in two languages. So I wanted to wrap this up by saying these are important topics when we're talking about supporting your English learners in your classroom, because what we're asking them to do essentially is to learn in English while they are learning English. And for any of you who have been in the position of trying to do that, I know I have in French, it's incredibly difficult. So applying the information and research that makes it easier not only on your students but you is really important, especially if it can be done without an extra load of work on you, because we already know teachers are so busy. It isn't like they have free time. And so I'm hoping that these are ideas for you that will be very efficient, easy to implement. So again, for me, you need to know the reading range. Of course, you always need to know that. But if you can know it in context of how much English they know, their English language proficiency level, you get a much better picture of how they're doing compared to their real peers, which would be students in their level and their same English language proficiency level. It gives you a reference point that I think that is really important. The second is, vocabulary knowledge affects reading comprehension. It's just not realistic to provide a student with a bilingual dictionary and hope that they will get enough out of what they're reading, learn enough out of what they're reading to move them forward. It's very difficult to do that unless they already have a high level of vocabulary on that text. Finally, it's really important that you support your curriculum, if possible, by having students read books, perhaps outside of the classroom, if there's not separate reading time for that in your classroom, that will give them that foundation of knowledge they need as they move forward in the grade levels. And if you can do that, it makes a huge difference in the outcome for these students, for these English learners long term. So those are the things I really wanted to share with you today. I thank you so much for spending this time with me. I hope you've enjoyed it. I know this is a topic I love, and I'm so happy to have spent this time with you. And most of all, I hope you have a great conference, and hope to see you next year. Thanks a lot. Bye.